Welcome back. In the last video, we learned about Bacon's Rebellion. So, why do we care about it, and what does it have to do with our discussion on race? Bacon's Rebellion hinged on his support from both white and black farmers and servants of wealthy colonists. Those wealthy colonists were shaken by his success, and they sought to prevent another uprising of its kind. To do this, they began to create laws and practices that made black slaves hereditary rather than indentured, and gave poor whites rights that were denied to poor blacks. For the first time, they used skin color as a way to divide poor people against each other, a pattern that we would see repeated throughout American history, and which we still see today. Out of the aftermath of Bacon's Rebellion was born the transatlantic slave trade and the concept of white supremacy. A note here, I am not going to talk about the institution of slavery in this class. While I absolutely think everyone should be exposed to the horrors that were unique to the American enslavement of people of African descent, too often we relegate the harm done to black Americans only to the period of American slavery. This lets us think of racism as something in the past, and not something that's happening currently. Prior to Bacon's Rebellion, we didn't have a concept of whiteness. People were defined by their ethnic backgrounds or their nationality, not by the color of their skin. After Bacon's Rebellion, the deliberate attempts to preference people with white skin over black and brown people, created a system we now call white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that those with a white racial identity are superior to those with other racial identities. It is built into our society at all levels, and has been since the very early days of the American colonies. Much like racism, it can be overtly and consciously expressed, or it can be subtle and unconscious. So, why do we talk about whiteness? Understanding the creation and perpetuation of the idea of whiteness is crucial to our understanding of how race functions in the United States. Usually, when we speak of race, we speak only of marginalized races, and we only get part of the picture. We need to examine whiteness because white supremacy normalizes whiteness and makes it invisible. Whiteness becomes the default, the normal way of being, and labels everything else as deviant. One of the readings for this week was Peggy McIntosh's article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. In it, she uses her experience with her marginalized identity, a woman who has experienced sexism, to examine all the ways her whiteness affects how she moves in the world. She discusses how nothing she learned in school taught her how whiteness is a dominant identity that put her in the role of an unwitting oppressor. She was taught that racism is an individual moral failing and not a product of a system we're all born into. She acknowledged how her racial privilege allows her to forget about her racial identity, because it had little impact on her day-to-day life. I'd like for you to pause here and run through the statements posed in this slide. If you have a dominant racial identity, chances are you'll be able to agree with most or all of these statements. If you have a marginalized racial identity, chances are you won't be able to agree with many of them. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that talking about whiteness and white privilege makes many people with white racial identities feel guilty and defensive. This is really common. As McIntosh pointed out, we're all taught that racism and holding privilege are personal moral failings. Outside of the few who are blatantly and proudly racist, though, that's not true. We are part of a system that was created long before any of us existed, and as we talked about with socialization, we're all pushed to perpetuate that system. That doesn't mean those with dominant identities do not experience privilege, just that we need to remember that those are not only unearned benefits, they're benefits that we're not asked for. Once we can see them, though, we get to decide what we do with our unearned benefits. I'd like to move now to how white supremacy shows itself. The most obvious way we see white supremacy is through the organization of white supremacists and white nationalist groups. While white supremacy is the belief that white people are innately superior, white nationalism is a movement that wants a whites-only ethno-state. As you can see here, this was from the gathering in Charlottesville, where white nationalists gathered to defend Confederate monuments. There's been a rise in the number of these groups, and in their estimated membership numbers. The advent of the internet has made it easier for all types of groups to find like-minded people, and the backlash to the election of Barack Obama created a spike in interest in these sorts of groups. Shown here is a map from the Anti-Defamation League's heat maps, which track hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, and terrorism. As you can see, every single state has had some sort of activity. However, these are only the most extreme examples of white supremacy. There are many, many ways we see white supremacy that are more subtle. One of the ways is the use of stereotypes for people who are not white. A stereotype is a generalized assumption about a person based on their group identity. As with prejudice, stereotypes that involve dominant identity groups making assumptions about marginalized identity groups can result in racially based oppression. Our reading by Jeremiah Torres, Label Us Angry, shows vividly how stereotypes can affect the targeted people. Another reading, From a Native Daughter, more subtly examines how stereotyping Native Hawaiians as primitive and less educated results in a denigration of oral historical traditions and creates a situation where white experts in an area are believed over the people who actually practice their native culture. Many people, particularly those with the dominant racial identity, profess to not see color at all. On the surface, this sounds very reasonable, as though they do not take race into consideration when making decisions about people with marginalized racial identities. However, colorblindness is problematic for a number of reasons. It ignores the very real differences in the experiences of people with dominant racial identities and those with marginalized racial identities. It continues to perpetuate the notion that racism is only an individual problem and not one built into our institutions and systems. Finally, it's usually used as a way to deflect criticism of racist thought or actions, or as a way to relieve the discomfort and guilt of the person with the dominant racial identity, while allowing that person to continue to not acknowledge their dominant racial identity and its role in contributing to oppression. Colorblindness does not ignore race. It acknowledges race while disregarding racial hierarchy. Finally, there's the concept of reverse racism. This is an accusation leveled at people of all races who attempt to point out elements of white privilege. Earlier, we talked about how racism is prejudice with an element of power. Racism, by its very definition, affects those who do not have dominant racial identities, and therefore do not have the social power those identities are given. Therefore, it is not possible for those with dominant identities to be the targets of racism. What is being experienced instead is prejudice, which is something that happens on an interpersonal level, and implies that the power dynamic is equal. This is the case for any oppression. Reverse sexism and reverse classism can't exist either, for the same reasons. And that's entirely the problem. Racism exists on a systemic level as well as an interpersonal one, and creates barriers in all aspects of life that prejudice simply does not. Accusations of reverse racism are attempts to redirect attention away from an individual's own behavior, and attempt to apply a social control to reinforce the dominant racial hierarchy. All of these examples of white supremacy are examples of individual white defensiveness about our role as a member of a dominant identity, and how our white identity blinds us to the experiences of black and brown people. Whiteness exists only as a part of a system of racial hierarchy designed to disadvantage those who are not white. And it doesn't just hurt those with marginalized racial identities. Throughout American history, to gain white privilege, many people have had to lay aside all or most of their cultural heritage. to forget what it means to be of French or Polish or Hungarian descent. We'll talk more about this next week when we tackle ethnicity.